Well, welcome to the Grace Podcast. I'm very excited for today's episode. I'm joined by Raymond Perrier. Perrier like the expensive water.
I like to think so, yes.
There we go. And Raymond, tell us about yourself. You're part of the Dennis Hurley Centre. Some of you may be aware of the Dennis Hurley Centre and the incredible work that they do around our city. But tell us about the context. How did you come to be part of that? I know Dennis Hurley is an amazing man, was an amazing man. But tell us your story and how you came to be part of that.
Certainly, and thanks so much for inviting me today.
Awesome.
So Dennis Hurley was the Catholic Archbishop of Durban for many, many years, 45 years. In fact, when he was made a bishop, he was the youngest bishop in the entire world.
Sure.
So he was around for a long time, and in that time had a huge influence on the church, not just the Catholic Church, but the wider Christian community in South Africa, and of course stood up against apartheid, one of the very first major Christian leaders to speak out against apartheid. He died almost 20 years ago, and there was a very strong desire to create something that would be a living legacy to who he was and what he stood for. And the three aspects of his life that we try to reflect in the Dennis Hurley Centre. First of all, to work with the poorest of the poor, something he did in his life, and something that we do working with homeless people and refugees right in the very heart of the city. Secondly, not just helping people in practical ways, which we do, but also speaking out for them. And a phrase that he would have used very much in the spirit of liberation theology was to be a voice for the voiceless. And that's a big part of our work. And thirdly, and most importantly, doing so not as a single religious community, but embracing as many communities of faith who want to work with us. So that means although the building is named after the Catholic Archbishop, we're working with Christians from all the different traditions and indeed people of other faiths. So we're right next door to the main mosque in the centre of Durban. We work very closely with the Muslim community, with the Hindu community, the Jewish, Baha'i, Buddhist communities, all people of faith who want to work with us. So that's what we are. We've been going for 7 years. And I came in to run the Dennis Hurley Centre 7 years ago. The intention was to come for 2 years, and I'm still here, fall in love with Durban.
That's how it often works.
Absolutely,
with God,
absolutely, yes. And of course, it was completely unexpected. I really didn't intend to be doing this at this time in my life, but the God of surprises never ceases to amaze me.
That's it. And are you from, where are you from? What's your background?
No, well, I'm from England, so the accent doesn't already give that away. In fact, when I first moved to Durban, I had a very weird experience. I would stand up to give talks, and people would look at the colour of my skin and then listen to my voice and say, "And which part of Chatsworth are you from?" Yes, I'm from the UK. Both my parents born and brought up in India. I was born in the UK, lived there most of the start of my adult life. I then spent some time living in the States. I worked in Uganda on mission work in Uganda for a few years. Came to South Africa 12 years ago. I was in Johannesburg for 5 years. And then the plan was to go back to the UK. And then I popped down to Durban for a few weeks. I got a tap on the shoulder by an extraordinary man called Paddy Carney, who founded the Dennis Hurley Centre. And he said, "Oh, so pleased to see you. I think I've got a job for you."
Amazing.
So as I say, that sense of the God of surprises. A great book, by the way, if you've never read it. Jerry Hughes, a Jesuit priest in Britain who I had the great privilege of living with some years ago. And the God of surprises is this notion that God's desire for us, God's plan for us is always so much greater than what we could ever conceive for ourselves.
So good.
But we are often, unfortunately, closed off to that. We think we know better than God, or we think we can kind of predict. We almost say, "Well, look, God, you're really busy. I'll do all the planning for you." And God obviously just laughs. So so this was very much for me the God of surprises. I came to Durban for a few weeks. I've been here for 7 years. Love the place, and I have no idea how long God wants me to be here. But I hope for as long as God does want me to be here, I get the chance to do this wonderful ministry.
That's incredible. I love that. I actually come from a Catholic background. Was Dennis Hurley, was it a Jesuit? Was he a Franciscan?
No, so he was actually a member of a wonderfully named order called the Oblates of Mary Immaculate.
Oh, wow.
A very, very grand title. So they were the main, initially French religious order who evangelized this part of South Africa, and particularly Lesotho. So they're very, very big in the Catholic world in this part of South Africa.
That's awesome.
And they were set up, interestingly, which ties in very much with our ministry. They were set up at the beginning of the 18th century, about 200 years ago, as a response to people moving from the countryside into the cities in France and discovering, of course, they were uprooted, they had no sense of
like an urbanization
community relationships, and the levels of poverty were appalling. It's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So they were very much a response to the Industrial Revolution, and their motto is, "Go and preach the good news to the poor." So they came to South Africa to do that 150 years ago, and that's what Hurley was doing throughout his life here in Durban.
Amazing. And a little bit of your own story in terms of faith. Have you always had a heart for justice, for, I mean, how did you come?
I hope so, yes. So from a very deeply faith-based background, I my family are Catholics, and my family come from the part of India that was colonized by the Portuguese, from Goa, hence the Catholic connection. I have 3 aunts who are nuns. I had a great uncle who was an archbishop. I mean, it's kind of family ministry. And so, but within that, I think, like a lot of people who grow up in the Catholic world, as you mentioned, you did, you get to that point where you think, well, actually, is this where I want to be? Is this where I'm called? And I spent some time thinking about that and reflecting on that, to some extent drifted away from it for a few years. And then in my mid-30s, I was working in London for a big advertising firm, traveling around the world, making lots of money, having a great time. And then in my mid-30s, I had this, what am I doing with my life moment?
Sure.
And much to my surprise, found myself giving up all of that and starting training to be a Jesuit priest. So a Jesuit is a particular type of Catholic priest. And I spent 6 years with the Jesuits in a very, very intense period of training and formation.
That's crazy.
Decided not to stay with the Jesuits, but to stay close to them, but to stay in Christian ministry. And so for almost 20 years, over 20 years, I've been working for the church in different guises.
What a cool story. From British banker to from capitalist.
Completely. And and it's one of those things where I look back on that, but what I find so fascinating about the work I do now is that all of those skills that I acquired in the commercial world all get used every day in the work of the Dennis Hurley Centre.
That's great.
And for me, that's an important part of what I think we're called to do.
Yeah.
Yes, we get the opportunity to learn stuff. I mean, I was very lucky. I had a fantastically good education in the UK. Went to University of Oxford, which is kind of nice. I was at college with Boris Johnson, that's less nice.
You still got some scars from that, okay.
And then the question is, given that we get these gifts from God, and they're grace, they are completely undeserved. It's just random that some people get stuff and other people don't get it.
It's like what Bono says, it's like a coincidence of longitude and latitude.
Absolutely, yes. So what do we then do with that? What are we called to do with that? And looking back on it, one of the scripture texts which most moved me as a teenager was the parable of the talents.
Yeah.
And of course, embedded in the parable of the talents is that sense that the more you get, the more is expected of you.
Yeah. To quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility.
I hadn't thought of that. That's another way of looking at it. Yeah.
You always got to throw a Marvel quote in there.
So how do we take the opportunities we're given? How do we take the talents we're given? How do we take the experiences we have and put them at the service of God, at the service of the church, and importantly at the service of the poor, because that's where we find God.
Yeah. Absolutely.
One of the nice metaphors for our work at the Dennis Hurley Centre, we're right next to the main cathedral in Durban, beautiful building, one of the finest buildings in the city, and it's called Emmanuel Cathedral. Emmanuel, of course, God is with us, exactly. And we get lots of school groups coming in to work at the centre. We're feeding homeless people every day. We fed 157,000 meals last year. And I say to these school groups, we are called, this is Emmanuel Cathedral, the project is called Inkosinati, God is with us. And there are 3 ways in which in this work God is with us. God is with us because without God, we just couldn't do this. How on earth would we do this kind of work on this scale, in this kind of environment, without God's help? Secondly, God is with us because you are the hands of God. That beautiful quote from St. Teresa of Avila, God has no hands on earth but ours, no feet on earth but ours. So you are here as God's hands to do God's work. But most importantly, every one of those faces you look at is the face of God in front of you.
Bearer,
And if you cannot look at each homeless person as somebody born in the image and likeness of God, then you're not living out your Christian calling.
Yeah, it's so good.
And of course, that's often the hardest thing to do. As people who want to engage in charity, who want to help the poor, we tend to want to do a bit of a distance.
Yeah.
We will hand out money to a guy at the robots. We won't talk to him.
Yeah.
Or we'll
even
tithe
struggle to make eye contact.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And I often say to people, if you do nothing else, wind down the window and greet somebody.
It's around dignity.
Talk to them, recognize that they are a fellow human being, a fellow child of God, and do what you can to recognize that in the other person, because then they see it in themselves.
Yeah. I think that's great. And I mean, as I was chatting earlier, we were in a series called Move That Mountain, and we speak about, obviously a mountain is a metaphor for obstacles, challenges, impossible tasks. And I think we tend to think of that in our own lives. I've got this mountain of debt, or I've got this relational struggle, but actually there are mountains in our world. There's mountains of injustice, of inequality, of inequity, of poverty, of racism, of prejudice. What Paul calls the stoicheia, the powers and principalities of this world. Sin is not just a personal thing; it's a systemic thing. And so we have a huge heart at Grace for for not just helping people in terms of their own struggles, but also looking at the systems and structures of our world. Like you say, being a voice for the voiceless.
Yeah.
It's not just about aid, it's not just about development, it's also about justice.
Yes.
And sometimes, give a man a fish, teach him to fish, and sometimes figure out who's killing the fish and polluting the water, or setting up a fence around the pool, because there's systemic structures. And I know you guys have a passion and a heart for that. But I think it does come down to what you said. You've been given a set of gifts, talents, abilities. A lot of that had nothing to do with your performance, where you were born, how you got educated, etc. And I love the story you mentioned, the story of the parable of the talents, because it's not really about how much talent you're given. It's about what you do with the talent. And I know in my life, it's often been a comparison thing. How come I got 2 and he got 3? And we want to compare to someone else's talents, but actually it's about what you do with that, whether it's a small talent or whether it's, not all of us went to Oxford, but it doesn't matter. It's how you use the gifts and the abilities that you have. And I think it's so cool. Like you said, all the stuff you learned in the financial world or in the business world, you're able to now use not just for yourself, but for a greater cause. And so I think that's really, really great. What do you think? Like, I think a lot of people listening to this will say, yes and amen. And, I'm so glad there are people like Raymond and centers like the Dennis Hurley. But that's sort of stopping short, isn't it? And it's how do people, because like you say, it's easy to give a handout, but actually it's harder to get to know someone's story. It's harder to get to know them by name, because now they're a human being. And I think in South Africa, because of apartheid, because of our history, because of our worldviews and our blind spots, we tend to think in an us versus them kind of category. And I think for me, the only way that breaks it down is proximity, because when you get in the room with someone, you realize he's afraid of the same things I'm afraid of. He loves this, we're all humans. Yes. What do you think are some of the biggest barriers for people in terms of using their time, their talent and their treasure, particularly their talent, from actually, what are some of those cultural barriers or mindset barriers that you think stop people from actually getting involved on the ground?
I guess 2 key words strike me. One is fear and one is pride. So fear is so interesting. What is the one phrase that Jesus repeats more often than any other in the Gospels? Do not be afraid. Do not fear. And we're terrified. And as Christians, unfortunately, we're terrified. We're terrified that God will ask too much of us. We're terrified that we somehow won't live up to God. Of course we're not going to live up to God, because we never will.
Yeah, we all fall
so
short.
Yes, exactly. So that just leave that to one side. We're fearful of our sinfulness. We're fearful of our inadequacy, and yet we are earthen vessels, Paul tells us. Of course, God understands all that, but God will keep asking more and more of us, and keep giving us the resources and the opportunities to do more and more.
Yeah, it's good. It's almost like the reason he said don't be afraid is because he knew he would be.
Completely. And unfortunately, one of the things which is built into South African society is, obviously long after legal apartheid is over, we still have the most appalling geographic apartheid.
Yeah.
And if you don't mind me saying, I've just driven literally 16 minutes from the Dennis Hurley Centre to here. It's like going from one universe to another. Mhlanga is gorgeous. The centre of the city is gorgeous in so many different ways. There's so many exciting and vibrant.
But you don't have to go far to see them. You've got walls that divide golf courses from shanty towns.
Completely. And unfortunately, people use fear as a justification for not crossing over those like, oh, I'm worried about security, or I'm worried about my children. And that's why that thing about talking to people at the robots, I say, wind down the window. Oh, I can't wind down the window, it's a bit scary. No, that's the point. You wind down the window because that's how you show your vulnerability. And if we can't be vulnerable to the people around us, then how do we let God into our lives? Because that's how God comes in. God comes in through our willingness to place ourselves in God's hands and to trust God and to step out of our comfort zones.
Yeah, it's the sobering words of Jesus, what you did unto the least of these, you did unto me. Well, where were you? Where did we see you? Oh, well, when you clothed me, and I think if we're not seeing, as you say, that imago Dei, that image in every single human, every person you've ever laid eyes on is made in God's image.
One of the very first experiences I had working with the homeless was in Glasgow, and a big inner city church, and it was very interestingly, the priest decided to keep the church open all through the day. Emmanuel Cathedral, similarly in town, is open all day, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. You see so many people going in to pray. Muslims who come in and they'll sit at the back and they'll pray because it's a sacred space. Anyway, there's a homeless guy who used to come in, and he spent most of the day sitting there because it was warm and it was comfortable, and there were some sofas at the back. And the priest used to say, "Have you seen Jesus today?" I said, what do you mean? He said, the homeless guy, I call him Jesus. I said, why do you call him Jesus? I call him Jesus just in case he is.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's
so,
awesome. Sure.
so part of it is that fear. We're not prepared to step out of our comfort zone. And secondly, I'm afraid there's an element of pride. There's a bit of thinking, well, I've done quite well, and obviously God has graced me with this. But
because I work hard.
Because I work hard. Yes, because I deserve.
Never mind, your domestic worker got up at 4 a.m. to catch a taxi.
And I'll discard a little to the poor to make me feel better. Now, I'm not against people giving to help the poor. And they want to give to organisations like us. Please.
There'll be a Zapper code on the screen right now. This video brought to you by
Give Now. But that's not enough.
Yeah.
That is not enough. And we cannot call ourselves Christians. We cannot call ourselves a faith-based organisation unless we do that. I had a very striking moment soon after we started. The mosque, who are just next door, came to us and said, we love the way how you're feeding people and we want to work more closely with you, and so we worked out how to do that and how to make it a halal kitchen. As far as we know, we're the only building in the world named after a Catholic archbishop that has a halal kitchen.
Wow.
But what they said to me is interesting. They said, we were really struck at how well the Christians treat the homeless. We didn't think that you would do that. I thought, ooh, that's interesting.
Sure.
That says a lot about what we as a Christian community project about how we look after.
So sad, isn't it? It's
and
like Jesus' words, they'll know us.
Yes,
they'll know we're Christians by our love. And you're like,
yes. So we need to do that. And one of the great things about the Dennis Hurley Centre, and a lot of Grace people have seen that at first hand by coming down, by being part of the street store programme that we do with you guys every year, and we're really excited. We'll be doing that again this June. Yeah. Is being in our kitchen and working alongside homeless people. So not I as somebody who has giving to those who haven't got, but sitting alongside somebody who's homeless and chopping vegetables with them or making sandwiches with them. Yeah. So a lovely story. Soon after we started, there was this really, really lovely older white woman from Durban North who used to come to work in our kitchen. And she said to me, I was a little scared when I first came, a bit anxious about coming down to the Dennis Hurley Centre to drive into town, and all these homeless guys at the robots, and they make me a bit intimidated. And I said, well, how are you feeling now? She said, now I'm okay. Now I'm much more relaxed. I said, what about Vusi? So Vusi is a young man who works in our kitchen and is homeless, or was homeless. And I said, well, what about Vusi? Don't you see him as, aren't you intimidated by him? And she said, oh, but I don't see him as homeless. I see him as Vusi.
Yeah,
that's the point.
That's the key.
When do we start seeing people as people? Not as the homeless, the refugee, the poor.
The whatever.
But see, and of course, that's that moment in the gospel. Remember, Jesus encounters Mary and says, Mary, calls her by name. He encounters the woman at the well. He encounters Zacchaeus. He calls them by name. He calls us by name. We have to call other people by name, because that's what it is to bring the good news. Yeah. Not to preach at them, not to wave Bibles at them, but to encounter the person face to face and say, you're broken, I'm broken. Yeah. A beautiful phrase that Pope Francis used, I'm a sinner, but I'm called. And that's our starting point. I'm a sinner, but I'm called.
I love that. I think that really is, as you say, it comes down to seeing people as people, and as you say, we've not only geographically isolated ourselves into our bubbles, but we've done that in our minds, and it's a bit of like a colonized kind of thing in a sense that, and again, we've worked really hard at Grace. We don't talk about the poor, we talk about the materially poor, because the reality is I'm also poor. Yeah. I'm poor in spirit. There's things that I have poverty in my life that, and I know something we've seen so much at Grace is whenever people have been involved in missions and justice, whatever we call, an outreach, or they've gone to go paint a school, or they've gone down to the street store, is 9 times out of 10, 99% of the time, they come back far more blessed than they ever went. They went to bless, and they went thinking, I'm going to help someone, but as a result, they come back going, oh my goodness, I have been so. And that's the paradox of faith, isn't it? Whoever tries to keep their life will lose it, but whoever's willing to lose their life will give it.
The more we give, the more we receive. The more we open ourselves, the more we can receive from others. The more we stay locked in our little boxes, then how is God going to get in? Beautiful Oscar Wilde line. How else but through a broken heart may dear Christ enter in? How do we allow our hearts to be broken by the reality of this incredibly unjust society that we have all benefited from? How do we allow our broken hearts to be open so that God can enter?
It's great. Break my heart for what breaks yours. Raymond, I'm sure we could keep going. I know I could keep talking for with you for so long. You've got so many interesting stories, and I know there's so much more. But we don't want to keep to our time. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you for what you do in our city. I pray that the partnership with Grace continues to grow. I love your vision and your heart for all people of our city and beyond that, and how God is using your ministry and through so many different people. So thank you. We honor you. We bless you guys. What I'd love from you is just maybe like a final parting shot to whoever's watching. What would you want to say to someone who's saying, hey, you know what, I want to make a difference. We talk about love God, love people, make a difference. I want to make a difference. I believe that part of our role as a follower of Christ is to bring the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, that's part of what we're doing. Maybe you want to just give some encouragement or maybe a challenge to say, hey, how do we do this? How do we join God's mission to bring healing and hope in our world? Kind of parting shot.
I'd encourage people to bring to mind somebody you see close to you. There might be somebody you work with, it might be somebody you've seen on the street, it might be somebody who initially you find a little hard to engage with. Bring them to mind, place them in God's hands, and then ask yourself this question: why has God placed that person in my life? What am I called to say to that person? What am I called, how am I called to engage with that person to make a difference in their life so they can make a difference in my life? And it could be in practical ways, it could be just from reaching out, from giving a smile, it could be allowing them into your home, allowing them into your life. But making sure that through that openness to God and through that openness to other people, we allow ourselves to be opened up to God.
That's great. Such a simple question, but such a practical next step. Who are those people in your lives? Thank you again so much for joining us. Thanks for joining us on the podcast, and we'll catch you next week. Have a great one.
Thanks.
Cool. Okay.
There we go.